Canada's Great Lakes have been linked to many strange and unexplained mysteries. The solitary existence of a lighthouse keeper has intrigued the imagination of people for generations. These lonely towers are the perfect setting for a ghost story, and Toronto's Gibraltar Point is no exception. In the summer of 1895, George Durant was hired to be the lighthouse keeper at Gibraltar Point. Operating a lighthouse is a lonely job, but for George it was perfect. He loved the peace and solitude the position offered. Durant had been on the job a short time when he began hearing footsteps coming up the circular staircase of the lighthouse. Each time he heard the footsteps, he would investigate, and each time he found no one on the steps.
Some theorize that there have been events which are so tragic in nature that they have become stuck in time for all eternity, with spirits condemned to repeat these horrific moments again and again. But can a spirit not only relive the past, but alter the present? Minutes from modern-day Toronto sits Gibraltar Lighthouse, where some say a ghost did just that.
One afternoon, while looking down from the lighthouse, Durant witnessed a bloodied, armless man who looked like he had been in a horrible accident. He quickly ran down the stairs to give aid to the man. But when he reached the base, this armless man had vanished. Sometime later, while enjoying a quiet moment at the top of the lighthouse, Durant had the feeling he was not alone. Turning, he found himself face to face with the armless figure. He saw the armless figure again one afternoon while performing maintenance, and again the figure disappeared. Durant ran to the railing where he saw the bloody figure at the base of the lighthouse. It seemed to Durant as if the man wanted him to follow. Durant ran down the stairs and saw the figure standing a short distance away. For a brief moment, they made eye contact. Durant could no longer deny that he was dealing with a ghost. He felt the ghost was trying to communicate with him. But why? And what was the message? Searching for an answer to the ghost's appearances, Durant decided to go through the old lighthouse logs. Many of the entries were by John Mueller, who had been the lighthouse keeper from 1809 until his mysterious disappearance in 1815. As he read the log entries, it became apparent to Durant that Mueller had enjoyed his position very much. Durant also learned Mueller had sold bootleg whiskey from the lighthouse to earn extra money. One day, two local thugs pounded on the lighthouse door. No one can say for sure what the motive for the visit was. Did they want to buy whiskey, or were they there to rob Mueller? After a brief exchange of words, Mueller decided he did not want to do business with them. The two thugs gave Mueller a savage beating. One of them decided to take things further. And in a brutal attempt to convince him to see things their way, they chopped his arms off, killing Mueller. The two thugs searched the lighthouse, but all they found was one bottle of whiskey. Now they had to find a way to cover up their brutal crime. They decided Mueller's body would be hacked to pieces, wrapped in burlap, and then buried on the island. The two were later arrested and charged with murder. However, they were cleared of any wrongdoing and released because the body of John Rayton Mueller was never found. As George Durant read the final log entries by Mueller, he again saw the figure at the base of the lighthouse, and it all fell into place. He ran to the spot where the armless ghost had been standing. There he found an empty bootlegger's bottle. Digging feverishly, Durant made a gruesome discovery. Although Durant never told authorities how he found the body, as a result of his discovery, the two suspects were arrested, charged, and convicted of Mueller's murder. The spirit of John Rayton Mueller continued to be seen by George Durant, but when he appeared, he was no longer a tortured, disfigured soul. To this very day, he can be seen wandering Toronto's Gibraltar Point and the park that now houses his beloved lighthouse. It seems that Mueller decided long ago to remain close to the only place on earth he considered his home. On a beautiful Prince Edward Island day, at the King's Playhouse in Georgetown, two actors were on stage, rehearsing a scene for an upcoming performance. The actors were shocked at the vision. The two ran off after their brief encounter with the captain.
King's Playhouse has had a torrid history, burdened by tragedy and lifted through victory, and within these walls, part of that history lives on in the form of a resident phantom.
A theater custodian was performing her nightly duties. She was responsible for seeing that the auditorium was put back in order after a performance. As she crossed the stage, she heard a faint whistling. As she stopped to listen, the whistling faded away. Perplexed, she continued on her way through the auditorium. At first glance, all appeared orderly, at least at first glance. She found herself under the stern scrutiny of the captain. Another had been witness to Captain George.
The King's Playhouse is a replica of the one which was destroyed by a major fire in the winter of 1983. A couple of the stories that I've heard personally is that after a violent storm, this captain who was shepherding the good ship washed ashore here, crawled up and managed to make it to the shores of Georgetown. And it is believed that his presence inhabits this facility.
With the burning down of the theatre, the recreated or rebuilt facility was very, very similar in fashion and style to the old one. Story has it then that the ghosts that occupied this building were satisfied and decided to stay and are still here. What seems to have happened is originally the railroad was here, and this area which the theatre now sits on was at one time known as Kent County, and contained also the graveyards from the oldest church on the island, which is just across the way there. And with the building and construction that went on as the town grew in its early days, story has it that several souls and their graves were disturbed and took occupancy here in the theatre.
On May 22nd, 2003, the town formally adopted a resolution stating that we wanted to name our resident phantom, our resident spirit. We called him Captain George.
During a rehearsal, the sound technician sat at her station, awaiting her cues. What she did not expect was the presence of the captain at this particular performance. As she was going through her cues, she felt uneasy, as if she was being watched. The source of her discomfort seemed to be coming from over her left shoulder. When she looked, she saw the captain sitting in his newly appointed seat. Nervously, she returned to her work, and Captain George continued to enjoy the performance.
An interesting event was the fact that the town council decided that the captain, rather than having to occupy whichever seat happened to be available for him so he could enjoy the show, passed a motion in council. And that motion was the chair be separated from the auditorium and placed in a particular spot for the sole and only use of the captain, thereby satiating this spirit during our shows. We do ask, therefore, that people, when they enter the auditorium, please don't occupy the captain's seat. It might upset him and therefrom upset our shows. But the ritual is carried on and the legend is carried on, and we thank the captain for allowing us into his theatre.
It is not yet known why the captain has chosen this theater as his home. One can only wonder if the official town declaration and his ever-reserved seat will keep him sitting here at the King's Playhouse eternally. A Thunder Bay couple rented a boat for a visit to White Otter Castle. They had heard so much about the isolated castle, but neither had been there before. They had planned to spend the day. It turned out to be the longest day of their lives. As the two became separated, Susan heard rustling in the trees. She had lost her bearings and called out to her boyfriend, Jake. There was no response, so she continued on. Susan felt uneasy, as if something was following her. Susan ran in terror after she saw a strange man suddenly appear out of nowhere. She ran as fast as she could, trying to outrun the strange man who was chasing her. The ghostly apparition pursued her. The ghostly stalker ceased his pursuit. It looked as though she had outrun whatever was pursuing her. Susan and Jake eventually found each other. She was shaking, apparently shocked. Jake attempted to calm her. Something had seriously frightened her.
Nestled in the beautiful landscape of northern Ontario, amongst the abundant pines and rivers, stands a structure that may oddly seem out of place. In the midst of a forest, a 3-story log castle rises through the trees on the shore of White Otter Lake near the town of Ignis. This magnificent building was constructed by a man often referred to as the Hermit of White Otter Lake.
The castle was built by Jimmy Mcewit. Rumor was that he was a Scotsman. He's of Scottish ancestry, but he was actually born in the eastern townships of Quebec. And in the late 1800s, he traveled by CP rail in the newly constructed railway to what was then Rat Portage, which is now Kenora on Lake of the Woods. And from then he went by steamer to Rainy River and homesteaded there. And then about the turn of the last century, he decided he had enough. He was doing well in farming, but he sold the farm, put all his money into his grubstake and went gold prospecting. And somewhere around 1900, 1902, 3, he ended up in White Otter Lake.
It was to be here, away from people, 30 miles and 17 portages from the nearest town, where Jimmy Mcewit would build this unlikely monument. Mcewit built this castle entirely by himself. 17 years later, this log castle would be finished. It is thought Jimmy built the White Otter for his young bride. Unfortunately, she was thousands of miles away in Scotland, but she was to join him soon. He wanted to build a majestic home for himself and his new wife, a castle for his queen. He continued to build, anticipating her arrival. As the castle grew, so did his impatience. His obsession began to eat at him, and soon this castle would consume him. His bride never came. In 1921, the body of Jimmy Mcewit was discovered when it washed up on the shore of White Otter Lake. His death was considered suspicious. No one knows how Jimmy drowned in the waters of the lake. Jimmy Mcewit was buried in a grave adjacent to his castle. There are tales told around campfires of Jimmy eternally wandering the grounds of White Otter Castle. The couple walked down to where the boat was docked, only to find that it was no longer there. They were now stranded. Forced to stay, they cautiously entered the castle. Jake assured his girlfriend everything would be fine. He could not have been more wrong. Jake stopped when he heard footsteps above him. Susan was frightened and did not want to be left alone. She quickly decided to join her boyfriend upstairs. Left without transportation and with the only shelter already occupied, they had no other choice than to spend the night on the beach. The next morning, they awoke to a pleasant and relieving surprise. The boat was exactly where they had left it the previous day. Discussion of the events was far from their minds. They simply wanted off this island. Exhausted and confused, they loaded the boat for the return trip home, leaving behind the castle and the hermit who still dwells there. White Otter Castle is on the shores of White Otter Lake, 80 kilometers north of Antikokan, Ontario. While off the beaten path, White Otter Castle is accessible to the public even today. Over a century ago, railroad baron William MacKenzie built the house of his dreams in Kirkfield, a quaint town in rural Ontario. This house is now a beautiful country inn. A desk clerk was starting his first shift at the MacKenzie Inn. He had no idea this was to be a night like no other.
Since construction began in 1888, Kirkfield, Ontario's Sir William MacKenzie Inn has been many things, from a private home to a school, even a convent, and now a bed and breakfast. This building has touched the lives of so many people, some of whom have chosen to stay on long after death.
A guest at the inn was leaving for the evening when she heard the sound of piano music drifting through the downstairs rooms. She followed the sound into the billiard parlor and heard the clack of pool balls in this otherwise empty room. Once again, she was startled to hear the sound of music, this time seeing a ghostly young girl seated at the piano. The child looked at her and quickly darted away. She was angry at the woman for interrupting her playing.
A number of reports of seeing a little girl. The previous owners to us in the restaurant reportedly seeing a young girl hidden with sort of shabby knees, dirty knees hidden underneath one of the counters there on a couple of occasions. In one of the closets up on the third floor where the domestic servants used to be during Mackenzie's time. And there's a very large lead-lined cistern up there that holds a whole lot of water. And a couple of different mediums had these impressions that a young girl might have been abused or drowned there, or perhaps even her body was put there after some foul play had come to her. Some people have said that they've seen a ghostly nun walking back and forth between the main residence, the inn, and the gatehouse. And of course, it was the sisters in the early 30s that put the extension on the gatehouse and built it into a two-floor building with the classrooms up there. And there's actually old original signatures on the walls up there of the tradespeople that built it. So there certainly can be a presence there, perhaps.
A noted psychic was staying at the MacKenzie Inn. She was awakened with the sensation of the entire room rocking, as if shaken by giant hands. An unseen force began pulling at her bedsheets, terrifying her. Without a moment's hesitation, she ran from the room. The next day, she decided not to leave the inn. Rather, she chose to hold a seance, assisted by one of the staff who had also experienced unexplainable events at the inn. As the seance progressed, she began to make contact with spirits. The first was an entity who identified herself as Sister Mary. The psychic asked her to move on in peace, but Sister Mary refused, claiming there was work to be done and she would not leave until it was completed. As the seance continued, the psychic made contact with a second presence who identified herself as Nellie. Nellie was apparently a housekeeper at the inn during the 1800s who stayed on because she loved the house so much. The psychic was exhausted, and the seance came to a close. The psychic detected that Sister Mary was there protecting the little girl seen by so many. Feeling she had failed to protect her in life, she was compelled to do so in death. That night, the psychic was awakened by a blinding blue light. She didn't know what to make of it until she looked over and saw the figure of Nellie knitting peacefully. Amazingly, the psychic remained calm and felt an overwhelming sense of warmth and joy emanating from Nellie. Nellie vanished, and the room returned to normal. But those feelings remained with the psychic ever since. Feelings reported by many fortunate guests at the Sir William MacKenzie Inn. The present owners and many of the guests can't deny that they are not alone, a simple fact that they have chosen to accept. And the spirits who linger at the MacKenzie Inn have made sure that those who check in as rigid skeptics always check out as true believers. In 1763, the road leading from Quebec City to the village of Lévis was deathly silent. A young woman made her way home, stopping to gather firewood along the way. As she passed the crossroads leading to Quebec City, she paused to marvel at the terrifying spectacle that hung there. The body of a woman had been placed in an iron cage and hung in the shadow of a large wooden cross. It was the body of a convicted murderess and witch. Summoning all her courage, she defiantly hurled pieces of firewood at the skeletal remains, cursing the evil woman. Suddenly, an unearthly moaning filled the night, and eerie shadows moved through the fog, and fear ran through her like a knife. She ran, but wherever she looked, she saw something in the fog and heard the moaning. She would never again challenge the power of the woman known as La Corriveau.
Occasionally, a ghost story goes beyond being a tale and becomes an integral part of local culture. In Quebec City, the story of La Corriveau is just that. A woman found guilty of witchcraft and murder has become a beloved part of Quebec history.
The legend of La Corriveau has a real special meaning to the people here in Quebec. When I came here, it was just something that they were constantly talking about. So after an extensive amount of research, the one thing that I did uncover is that there wasn't one story about this woman that was exactly the same.
Historical records show that Marie Corriveau was a beautiful young woman who lived near Quebec City during the 1760s. She had many suitors and eventually married. They settled down to what her husband hoped would be a normal life. He didn't know that Marie had a secret occupation. When her husband was away, she would place a lantern in the window. This was a signal to her customers that it was safe to enter by the back door. This secrecy was vital, as Marie's business was witchcraft. Marie had been a practicing witch since childhood and had a very successful business selling her charms and potions to wealthy customers. Her real expertise, though, was creating undetectable poisons, and murder became Marie's specialty. Marie kept her business a secret from her husband until he came upon some of her charms. As a devout churchgoer, he was horrified and ordered her to end these pagan practices. Marie reluctantly agreed, promising to become a good and dutiful wife. For a short time, she lived up to her promise, and their home became a model of domestic tranquility. Marie's husband was content, feeling he would once again have the pretty and obedient wife he had hoped for. Marie did not share his contentment and had no intentions of giving up her profitable business. Perhaps if Marie's husband had been aware of her expertise in the area of untraceable poisons, he would have been less trusting. Marie used all of her experience to create a very special surprise for her husband. She had been experimenting with mercury, which in combination with other elements was a deadly poison. One morning, as her husband quietly slept, Marie entered the bedroom, carrying her newest creation. It took only a few drops poured directly into the sleeping victim's ear. The effects were almost instantaneous. The acid-like combination of mercury and other elements burned through his eardrum and into his brain. He died horribly as Marie looked on. In a tribute to her skills, Marie's poison was undetected, and it was declared that her husband died naturally of a stroke, leaving her to continue her profitable business unencumbered.
As I said, there have been many books written about Le Corriveau. Many of them have said she had 20 husbands. Many of them said she had 7 husbands, of which she'd murdered all of them. But the most consistent seems to be she had 2 of them.
Marie's widowhood was rather short-lived, and a few months later she remarried, this time to a prosperous trader who was away much of the time. At first, she settled into the facade of married life, but eventually her new husband began to ask too many questions and seemed suspicious. Marie began to feel he was a liability and decided to take action. Once again, she crept into the bedroom. This time, her technique was less subtle. She simply used a meat cleaver. She dragged the body to a nearby stable and tearfully claimed her husband had been trampled to death. The authorities did not believe her tale. Then Marie deviously accused her own father of the murder, and he was tried and sentenced. Her father confessed to a priest that he had pled guilty only to protect his daughter. Marie was quickly arrested, and the press dubbed her Le Corriveau. She was tried and sentenced to hang. This was the first death warrant issued by the new British government. With her dying breath, she cursed her accusers and swore she would return from the grave. And perhaps she did.
She was hung, and then her body was placed into an iron cage that had been made to look like a human body. This cage was hung up on public display, which was a big punishment for the British at that time. And that's when the ghost sightings started. Many of the residents of Levy, where this cage was hung up, said that they were seeing ghost sightings of Le Corriveau during the night. They heard blood-curdling screams coming from this cage. It was extremely terrifying. Finally, they couldn't stand anymore, and they demanded that the British authorities bury that cage.
A passing vagrant who was unaware of the strange events surrounding the cage was hired to remove it. So feared was Le Corriveau that no local person would accept the job. For a few shillings, he was told to drag the cage into the forest and bury it in an unmarked grave. Though he did not know the legend of La Corriveau, fear ran through him from the moment he touched the cage. As he dragged it off, he heard sounds from the nearby woods, low, unintelligible whispers. But the starving man, desperate for a few shillings, pressed on. He buried the cage at a secret location, and in this unmarked grave, the legend of La Corriveau should have ended. For over a century, the forest was quiet until workmen dug up the unmarked grave. Knowing the legend of La Corriveau and the value of the cage, a famous showman made a very regrettable decision.
The wonderful legendary circus person P.T. Barnum came up here and bought that cage, and he hung it up in the American Museum in New York City. Now, no sooner was that cage hung up on the 4th floor when a terrible fire broke out at the museum, which eventually burned it right to the ground. And unfortunately, so did that cage burn and melt, which put an end to one of Quebec's most infamous murderesses. With this cage, there came some unnerving experiences, such as the museum burning down to the ground, the apparitions of La Corriveau, the screaming noises. One can say that this cage certainly contributed to the legend of La Corriveau.
Though Marie Corriveau's infamous cage was destroyed with Barnum's museum, more than just her story survives. Perhaps the spirit of Quebec's most beloved and notorious legend will live on forever at the crossroads leading into the city. Montreal is one of the most beautiful and storied cities in Canada. One afternoon, a tourist was exploring Rue St. Paul, one of the main streets in the city's historic district of Old Montreal. During her stroll, she ventured onto a side street when suddenly a bloody man stepped out of the shadows and approached her. Although his body seemed almost transparent, she could see that both his face and chest were bleeding. He spoke to her in a French dialect she could not understand. The only words she recognized were, "Je suis innocent," I am innocent. As he spoke, she received mental flashes of pain and suffering so vivid she could almost feel it herself. Confused and frightened, she backed away. The man turned away from her, and she saw wounds crisscrossing his back, as if he had been whipped. Then, just as suddenly as he appeared, the figure vanished.
Old Montreal is a city rich in culture, with tales of triumph, tragedy, and more than a few ghosts. Rue St. Paul has 2 well-known spirits, each with their own tragic tales of suffering. This is truly a street of tortured souls.
Rue St. Paul in Old Montreal is a perfectly preserved time capsule of New France. Among its shops and beautiful buildings roam 2 tortured spirits from its violent past. The irony of these 2 ghosts is that although they never met in life, their eternal torment was brought about by the same evil man. The first is a man named Valiere, who in 1732 was arrested without reason. A scheming neighbor sought his property and conspired to have him falsely accused and convicted, thereby forcing him to forfeit his land. The executioner prided himself on his ability to make anyone confess, regardless of their innocence. But the executioner was not prepared for the strong will of Valiere. Despite endless and brutal torture, the executioner could not break the man. When Valiere could take no more, he summoned his last bit of strength and hung himself on the very chains that imprisoned him. The executioner was enraged. A prisoner's suicide without a confession would be a black mark on his perfect record. To hide his failure, the executioner carried the body outside into an alley off Rue St. Paul and left it. Valiere would be just another victim of street criminals. Since that day, Rue St. Paul has been haunted by a bloody, beaten man proclaiming his innocence. But Valiere is not alone on Rue St. Paul. There is another, perhaps even more tragic ghost. For over 2 centuries, residents and tourists have encountered a beautiful, dark-skinned woman walking the streets bearing a torch. She is believed to be Marie Joseph Angelique. In death, she is a spirit. In life, she was a slave. Angelique was owned by a wealthy Montreal businessman when she learned she would be sold to an American slave trader. All her life, she had prayed for her freedom, and if she were sold, that dream would be shattered. In a fit of rage, she took revenge on her master by burning down his estate. Unfortunately, the blazing fire swept through old Montreal, burning over 40 dwellings to the ground. Miraculously, no one died in the fires, but there was a massive loss of property, and the people demanded justice. Angelique was dragged before the same interrogator and executioner as Valiere. In this era, evidence was not required, only a confession extracted by any means necessary. One wonders what sort of man would be ruthless enough to carry out this twisted brand of justice. In fact, this was a man with the most despised job in Montreal. Executioners were forced to conceal their identities with masks. They took great pride in their masks and attire, feeling it added a degree of intimidation and mystery. After days of endless interrogation, Angelique eventually confessed, though few believed she actually committed the crime. Her order of execution was handed down, and the penalty for her crime was as twisted as it was humiliating. Angelique was sentenced to walk the streets with a sign hung from her neck which read "Incendiaire," or arsonist, carved from the very wood of her master's burnt home. She was forced to walk the streets, bearing a torch, begging for forgiveness along the way. She was then brought to the gallows and hung. Angelique's body was burnt on a pyre, and her ashes scattered over Rue St. Paul. It is in the very spot where her ashes were strewn that she is still seen walking the streets with her sign and eternal torch. Angelique's suffering was not in vain. Her story echoed through the halls of Parliament as an example of the horrors of slavery and was instrumental in its ultimate abolishment. The bloody and beaten Valiere and the tormented Angelique live on in spirit. As for the executioner, he simply faded away and became a mere footnote in history, remembered only for these 2 tragic events. Many things on Rue St. Paul may have changed over the years, but 2 things have remained. The restless souls of Angelique and Valiere live on, sentenced to spend the afterlife searching for justice and forgiveness on the streets of old Montreal. An employee of this lush resort went to check a room before its next guest arrived. What he did not expect to find was a guest who had never left.
St. Andrews by the Sea, New Brunswick, is a beautiful community, home to a fortunate few and visited by thousands each year. The gem of this tiny hamlet is the magnificent Fairmont Algonquin Resort. Designed like no other in Canada, this posh and exclusive resort offers more than just exquisite dining and impeccable service. If you're lucky, you may catch a glimpse of one of its many resident spirits.
One of the oldest spirits living at the Fairmont Resort is a long-dead young bride. On her wedding day, she had checked into room 423. She patiently awaited the arrival of her new husband. Her patience, however, went unrewarded. Her husband never came. Many believed that the young bride died of a broken heart. Although the young bride did not die at the Fairmont Algonquin, it seems that her spirit has returned to the place where her tragic story began.
A grand hotel in operation for over 114 years, first built in 1889. One fire in 1913 where the community rebuilt the hotel, and it was soon taken over by the Canadian Pacific Railway and run primarily by them since then. Some of the ghost stories that surround the Fairmont Algonquin include a young bride whose heart was broken here. She's been with us for many years now.
The resort's dining room is another area which is frequented by ghosts. Over the years, the spirit of the young bride has become more and more restless, and now she seems to torment the staff for her own pleasure. One ghostly act this playful and mischievous spirit is known to do is to repeatedly rearrange the silverware, even after it has been put in its proper place time and again. A staff member was setting tables for the dinner guests. As she walked by each table, she rearranged the position of any misplaced item. Stopping at a table, she saw that it was in much more disarray than the others, as though somebody had deliberately moved the cutlery and plates. A diligent worker, she reset the table as it should have been and continued on with her preparations. Returning to the dining room, she was shocked to see that the table she had just corrected was once again in shambles. As she was rearranging the table, she had the unmistakable feeling of someone else being in the room with her. Suddenly, an apparition dressed in white appeared beside her. Frightened, she bolted from the dining room, leaving behind the poor young bride. Paranormal experiences within the hotel have not been isolated to the staff. Many visitors and guests have also witnessed the unexplainable. A guest who had checked into the hotel was carrying her own bag to her room. Upon entering, she was greeted by a quiet but helpful bellhop. He took her bag and ushered her to the elevator. Neither of them said a word to each other. The courteous bellhop led the guest down the long hallway, eventually arriving at her room. Setting the bag down, he opened the door for her. The guest entered her room, dropped her things, and grabbed a tip for the helpful young man. But when she returned to the hall, he was gone. The bellhop was nowhere in sight, as though he had vanished. With a constant flow of new guests coming in and out regularly, hotels and inns are notorious for strange occurrences. Who the bellhop is, or why this restless bride rearranges the tables, remains a mystery. We only know that these two restless spirits linger on eternally, living out their unfulfilled lives amid the luxury at the Fairmont Algonquin resort. In 1920, the remote community of Fort Kent, Alberta, was the scene of one of the most infamous occurrences of the native spirit of vengeance that preys on animals and humans, called the Windigo. The Windigo appears in many different forms, from a massive fur-covered creature to a dark, misty shape. But when the right host body is found, it can also possess a human being. One night, a local rancher heard the sounds of his horses being spooked. He found several of his animals brutally slaughtered. Suddenly, he was startled by an unearthly howl. As he looked off in the direction of the howl, he saw a dark shape with two brilliantly glowing eyes. He fired at the shape, and it seemed to disappear, but the terrifying howl echoed on in the darkness. At that moment, the rancher knew that he had just encountered the spirit of the Windigo.
The Aboriginal people of Canada have a rich tradition of folklore, which settlers were quick to dismiss as fiction. But the settlers in the northern Alberta community of Fort Kent lived in terror as a native legend came to life, bringing death to their small town.
In the 1800s, Fort Kent was a rather vibrant community. There was a lot of logging happening in the area. But once the natural resources dwindled, the town dwindled to a much smaller population. It became a very transient town. In the 1920s, a doctor emigrated from England, Dr. Thomas Burton. He had witnessed atrocities during the war and wanted to move to a small, quiet community with his wife, Katie. So they emigrated to Fort Kent and set up a medical practice.
The townsfolk were overjoyed to have a physician with Burton's qualifications nearby. Almost immediately, Burton and his wife became pillars of the community. The couple settled into a new home in the wilds of Alberta. Burton was eager to start his life anew, leaving the horrors of the Great War behind him. The animal mutilations continued. The town's ranchers were losing stock on a nightly basis. Local ranchers were terrified and enraged, not knowing how to stop the beast that was devastating their livestock. Burton himself was now starting to feel the tension too. But for the once tranquil town of Fort Kent, this horror was only the beginning. The worst was yet to come. Disease began to ravage the community, striking both young and old in staggering numbers. Burton did what he could with the primitive medicines available, but the epidemic grew, and he was unable to deal with the ever-increasing number of patients. The townspeople came begging for help, but Burton felt powerless. The horror of the epidemic struck home when Burton's beloved wife Katie fell victim to the disease. He was devastated and did all he could to save Katie from certain death, but his efforts were wasted and she died within days. The locals pounded on his door relentlessly, begging him for help, but after suffering through Katie's death, he had slipped into a deep state of shock. While Burton hid in his home, refusing to answer his door, the disease ravaged the entire town. Legend has it that while a grief-stricken Dr. Burton mourned the loss of his wife, the spirit of the Windigo found its perfect host. Immediately following his wife's passing, something terrible happened to Thomas Burton. It is believed that the spirit of the Windigo took possession of his soul. When he finally emerged from his home, the locals were thrilled to see him, not knowing that his intentions were no longer to heal the sick. He visited house after house, methodically killing everyone he encountered. That fateful night, Thomas Burton is believed to have killed 24 people and was never seen or heard from again. The next day, a young man who had been sent off in search of medication and supplies returned to find the ghastly scene in Fort Kent. Everywhere he looked, the bodies of his family and friends were strewn about, mutilated, some partially eaten. It was a horrific sight. The only body not found among the dead was that of Dr. Thomas Burton. When the police completed their investigation, the evidence clearly pointed to Burton as the murderer. Although Burton was never found, in his absence, he was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. The official verdict was that he had been possessed by the spirit of the Windigo and transformed into the flesh-eating cannibalistic creature of legend. It is said the Windigo can take over the body of someone who has experienced horrifying, life-altering events or tasted human flesh. Did Thomas Burton's experiences in the trenches of Europe during the First World War mark him as a host body for the Windigo? Or could the death of his beloved Katie have pushed him over the edge of sanity? The tiny hamlet of Fort Kent is now a popular hunting and fishing mecca. And though Dr. Burton's notorious rampage occurred almost a century ago, his legend lives on through continued reports of the Windigo's unearthly howl echoing through the darkness. A penitentiary is a desolate place. The simplest comforts bring great relief to the stress of everyday prison life. Maybe that's the way Huel felt about one particular book. A neighboring inmate wanted this book and removed it from Huel's cell, resulting in a swift response from Huel. The prison guards were able to stop Huel's vicious attack before he killed his neighbor. At the time of Huel's incarceration, human rights, in particular an inmate's rights, were not a concern. The prison system had its own violent brand of punishment.
Much can be said about the conditions within the walls of antiquated prisons. They were cold, dark places, rife with disease. Inmates were beaten and tortured, both by guards and fellow inmates. It is no wonder a building which housed these atrocities is haunted. The Kingston Penitentiary in Kingston, Ontario, is one such building.
Huel's punishment was severe. He was brutally beaten and forced to tailor the officers' uniforms in his cell. This work assignment should have been given more consideration by the administration. Ironically, it provided Huel a means for revenge. Huel's plan ended in tragedy.
We're now standing at Kingston Penitentiary, which is just behind me. It was the men's prison here in Kingston. It was built beginning in 1832, and it's still around today, though it's not in use at the moment. Huel was a man who was imprisoned here in Kingston Penitentiary beginning in 1887. He lasted for 10 years in the pen and was finally shot and killed by a chief keeper in 1897 at Kingston Penitentiary. Huel swore before he died that he would take one of the men down with him, and since he didn't succeed, he also swore that he would be back to haunt the guards at Kingston Penitentiary.
Huel kept his dying word. Responding to an inmate's cry for help, the guards found nothing. They dismissed the disturbance and warned the prisoner to behave. Later that evening, the duty officers too had an encounter with the spiteful Huel. Rigid with fear, the guards somehow knew this would not be the last time they would see Huel. The Kingston Penitentiary in Ontario is still today a prison, and unless you are very unfortunate, you will never be permitted inside. However, outside the walls is Canada's Prison Museum, where one can explore all aspects of Kingston Penitentiary living, past and present. Many years ago, a tragic and violent incident occurred, and out of this terrible event, a legend was created. There is a bell on the 7th tee. It is said that if you ring this bell 3 times, the ghost of Doris Gravlin will appear. Unbeknownst to this man, the legend was more than just mere folklore. The ghost of Doris did appear. In fact, it seemed every which way the man turned, Doris appeared. This myth is dismissed by most, but there are those who claim this superstition to be true.
The Victoria Golf Course in Victoria, British Columbia is one of Canada's most exclusive courses, attracting honorable and wealthy citizens. Its rolling greens are not the only attraction.
We're at the Victoria Golf Club, established in 1893. It's one of the oldest golf courses in Canada. It's in the community of Oak Bay, part of Victoria, British Columbia. It's a beautiful seaside golf links. It's also very haunted.
Doris Gravlin left her husband Victor. His abusive behavior and excessive drinking had finally become intolerable. After her departure, Doris received a letter from her Victor asking her to meet him at the golf course so the two could talk about reconciling their marriage. He told her that he had stopped drinking and was on the road to recovery, but it was all lies. In a drunken stupor, Victor lost control of his temper. Realizing what he had done, he fled. In an ironic twist, he too was to suffer the consequences of his excessive drinking. Some days later, a young caddy began his work at the course. As part of his duties, he walked the length of the golf course in search of stray balls. His search led him through some of the golf course's more obscure locations. The young lad had the misfortune to discover the bodies of Victor and Doris, but this would not be the last time the young caddy would see Doris. Many months later, the caddy resumed his employment at the golf course. As the caddy reached one of the sand traps, he saw a mysterious set of footprints. He was confused, but nonetheless he performed his task, raking the sand, clearing it of any debris. The caddy looked up and was terrified to see the dead woman he had stumbled across months previously, staring directly at him.
People who are very interested in seeing ghosts often come to the Victoria Golf Course, and they're rarely disappointed.
Late one evening, a woman crossed the golf course, bringing a friend, thinking it to be shorter than her normal route home. However, the time she saved came at a costly price. The women were separated when one of them stopped to tie her shoe. The other woman thought she saw her friend's extended arm, so she took the hand, and it felt cold.
Sarah?
At that moment, she heard her name being called from somewhere behind her. And what they saw, they will never forget. According to superstition, 7 is a lucky number. But on the 7th tee at the majestic Victoria Golf Course, your luck may run out, bringing you face to face with Doris Gravlin. On a normal day of operation, the Cumberland Heritage Museum received some artifacts. The items were to be placed on display in the portion of the museum called the Duford House. But it would seem that 2 of these items were ultimately not meant to be part of the exhibit.
often when someone holds an object dear to their heart in life, they take this connection with them beyond the grave. This phenomena is very visible at the Heritage Museum in Cumberland, Ontario. In the museum's Duford House, there is a spirit who remains possessive of two of the house's wonderful artifacts.
Museums acquire artifacts from many different places. Although many practical things can be learned from them, the authentic history of some of these artifacts remains a mystery. One may speculate that the little girl who once owned these dolls in her life still shares a connection with them in her death.
Here at the Cumberland Heritage Museum, a lot of people feel that the Duford house is inhabited by spirits. Other fellow employees have experienced cold chills and footsteps being heard around upstairs, as well as the dolls being moved around for them as well. Now, a lot of people believe that it is the spirit of the little girl who is playing with the dolls that is moving them around. Now, my particular experience here at the Duford house was an unnerving one. I walked in at the beginning of my shift to straighten up things before tour arrived, and I found the two dolls lying on the floor here in the living room. And I'm almost certain that nobody else was in the house before me, so I picked them up and I brought them back upstairs. As I was straightening out the bedroom, a fellow employee of mine had come into the house and he had given them to me when I had just put them down on the chair behind me. Needless to say, this disturbed me a little bit. So we placed them, I placed them back onto the chair and I went back down the stairs to straighten up the dining room. When I realized again that the dolls were there in the dining room on the buffet. And that was when I left the building.
The Duford House is a recreation of life in the early 1900s. Everything in the museum is authentic turn-of-the-century fare, including the little girl who continues to play with her beloved dolls.